3 days. That's how long Evelyn Harper and her children had sat in the frozen silence of an abandoned railway station, the snow burying them like a grave they hadn't yet entered. Their breaths rose in thin white threads, their stomachs hollow, their eyes wide and dim. She clung to them, whispering stories to keep their hope alive, though her own hope was cracking apart with every gust of wind. The station had been forgotten, just as she had been cast out, blamed unwanted. But when the crunch of boots broke through the storm, she lifted her head and saw a figure step from the white. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has gone. The year was 1887, and the plains of Dakota were smothered in snow so deep the land itself seemed to have disappeared. Wind rushed across the empty fields with a voice like morning dragging icy claws over the wooden shell of the old station house. Paint peeled from its siding, its sign dangled crooked, and the waiting bench had splintered down the middle. No trains had come this way in months. To Evelyn Harper, the silence of the place was almost fitting. She sat on that broken bench with her 4 children pressed into her skirts. Her shawl, stiff with frost, barely covered her shoulders. Evelyn's hair, once chestnut and full, now clung limp and brittle around her face. She had been pretty once, so her late husband used to tell her, but the cold stripped everything away. All that was left was bone breath and the stubborn will not to collapse. 10-year-old Clara sat on her left jaw clenched, trying to hide her shivering so the younger ones wouldn't notice. Evelyn felt her daughter's tiny body trembling anyway. Samuel, barely 7, rubbed his raw hands together, his breath rattling in a weak cough. 4-year-old Ben leaned against Evelyn's shoulder, his skin hot and clammy, despite the chill. Little Grace, just 3, curled in her mother's lap, her tiny fists clinging to Evelyn's skirts, her face buried deep in cloth for warmth. Evelyn had not eaten since the morning of the first day. Whatever scraps she'd found, she gave to the children. She distracted them with stories in a hushed voice, stories of their father roping wild mustangs, of warm prairie summers, of fresh bread cooling on the window ledge. But her words, too, grew brittle, each one fragile as icicles threatening to snap in her throat. The sky was a flat sheet of white. Even the horizon had disappeared, as if the world itself had given up on shape or hope. Evelyn pressed her cracked fingers into Clara's coat, the motion more instinct than strength. She thought of walking, of trying to find shelter anywhere else, but her legs were heavy with exhaustion, and she had nowhere left to go. Her mind drifted to the night she'd been cast out. Her husband had been dead only weeks when his family turned on her. A debt collector's blood had been spilled, a fight gone wrong, and though she had sworn she knew nothing of any hidden money, her in-laws spat the word curse at her like it was her name. They'd thrown her into the snow with the children still crying, and she had stumbled toward the only place she knew, the station. 3 days, 3 nights, nothing but wind hunger and silence. She prayed, though she wasn't sure who was listening. She prayed her children would sleep instead of starve, that they would see spring again, even if she didn't. Then it came, the sound. Soft at first, muffled by snow, then clearer. The deliberate, steady rhythm of boots crunching across the frozen ground. Evelyn's heart clenched. Fear shot through her chest. Out here, strangers could be salvation or ruin. She lifted her head slowly. From the storm's haze, a figure emerged. A tall man, broad-shouldered coat, heavy and long, his hat brim pulled low. Snow clung to him in patches, melting on dark gloves. He moved with the gait of someone used to distance, to cold, to hardship. His presence seemed to press against the storm itself, steady and unyielding. He stopped only a few feet away. His eyes swept over her children, then found her. Gray eyes sharp and restless, like the sky before a storm breaks. He pulled off his gloves, breath curling white between them. "You been out here long?" His voice was deep, measured, neither rushed nor hesitant. Evelyn's lips parted, but her throat closed. She swallowed, then forced the truth out, stripped bare of excuse or pride. 3 days. No judgment flickered in his eyes. He nodded once, simple, certain. Then, without a word, he shrugged off his coat. The thick wool dropped over her shoulders with a weight that startled her. It was still warm from his body. The sudden heat made her dizzy. "I'm here for you," he said quietly, as though the words might shatter if spoken louder. Clara's wide eyes lifted. Samuel's hands froze mid-rub. Even little Grace stirred. The man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out biscuits wrapped in cloth. He offered them forward. Samuel hesitated only a heartbeat before grabbing one and breaking it in half to give Ben. Evelyn's throat burned as she watched. Pride and desperation pulled at her, warring inside her chest. She lifted her gaze. "What's your name?" Her voice was hoarse. "Caleb Donovan," he said. "Folks just call me Caleb." His gaze stayed on her, steady, unflinching. She gave her own name. Evelyn Harper, waiting, bracing for a flicker of recognition, for him to remember the rumors, the whispers. But his expression never shifted. He only nodded once, storing it away. "Come on," he said finally, his tone gentler. "It's too long a winter to spend out here." The children's eyes turned to her. Clara's hand slipped into hers, begging silently. Evelyn's body ached. Her pride resisted, but she knew this much: if she stayed here longer, stillness would come. The kind of stillness one didn't wake from. She gathered her strength, pulled Grace tighter in her arms, and rose from the bench. Caleb offered his hand, not in command, but in steady support. Her frozen fingers slid into his. The storm swallowed the abandoned station behind them as they stepped into the white. Snow hissed across the flats as if trying to erase their footprints as quickly as they made them. Caleb took the lead, his stride unhurried but relentless, reins looped in one hand as his bay gelding followed with a soft grunt and a plume of steam. Evelyn walked half a pace behind Grace, bundled to her chest beneath the borrowed coat. The other three children clustered close and holding to the long hem of her skirt like shipwrecked sailors clinging to a rope. Samuel Caleb said over his shoulder, voice low but carrying "You ever sit a horse?" Samuel's eyes lifted, red-rimmed but curious. He shook his head, then glanced at the gelding with a mixture of fear and hunger. "Today is a good day to learn to ride and rest." Caleb stopped, swung the saddle blanket down, and patted the horse's withers. "We'll take it easy." He lifted Samuel as if the boy weighed no more than kindling, setting him across the saddle and securing him with a knotted lead around the horn so he wouldn't slip. Ben stared up, blue lips parted. "You too," Caleb said gently. "You'll ride in front of your brother." Ben looked to Evelyn for permission. She nodded because her legs were shaking and because even pride needs mercy. Caleb swung Ben up and settled him against Samuel, tucking the blanket around their knees. The horse flicked an ear patient as a stove. For the little one, Caleb added, glancing at the bundle in Evelyn's arms, "We'll trade when your arms get tired." "My arms don't get tired," Evelyn said, more bravado than truth. Caleb's mouth ticked, not quite a smile. He adjusted the coat around her shoulders anyway, pulling the wool close at the throat until her breath warmed the cloth. They moved again. Wind pressed at their fronts, trying to turn them back, but Caleb's path cut between two low rises where the drifts lay shallow. He knew where the snow would be crusted strong enough to hold a footfall and where it would swallow a person whole. When they came to an old fence line, he found a gap at a leaning post, lifting the bottom wire so Clara could duck beneath. "You always know where to go in a storm?" Clara asked. Teeth chattering but spirit bright as a struck match. "Storms don't change the land," Caleb said. "They just hide it. You learn the lines before the snow comes." Evelyn stole a look at him as he walked. He moved like the country itself, quiet, measured, carrying its own weather. He did not ask them for explanations. He did not tell them what they had done wrong to end up in such a place. He only placed his strength in front of theirs and asked them to follow. The first mile fought them. The second mile dulled their fingers and toes. By the third mile, the air pressed cold needles into Evelyn's lungs. Grace stirred in her arms and whimpered the smallest sound, as if she were afraid to waste breath. "Here," Caleb said, stopping beside a stunted pine that broke the wind like a wall. He shrugged off his haversack, produced another cloth parcel, and opened it to a heel of cornbread and strips of dried apple. "Slow. Chew easy." Evelyn shook her head, instinct already rising to refuse to leave it for the children. Caleb read the refusal in her face before she spoke. "Take a bite, Mrs. Harper," he said softly. "Children watch what their mother does." Her cheeks burned with something that wasn't the cold. She broke a corner free and placed it in her mouth, the taste almost painful in its sweetness. She fed another crumb to Grace, who opened her lips like a winter bird, and then burrowed back into the coat. Clara chewed carefully, eyes on the endless white. How much farther? 2 more miles if the creek's hard, Caleb answered. 3 if not. He looked to Evelyn. "You holding up?" "I'm fine," she said, and her voice did not wobble because that was how she kept her world from falling apart, one steady word at a time. They crossed a shallow draw where willow twigs rattled like beads on a string. Caleb tested the creek with the butt of his glove, then stepped onto the ice-weight-centered boots flat. It held. He led the horse across, then returned for Evelyn and Clara, taking the girl's hand when she hesitated. On the far bank, the wind seemed to ease, and for a few blessed minutes, Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat instead of the storm. "Why were you at the station?" Caleb asked, not glancing back as if a question asked to the air could be answered without shame. "Because I had nowhere else to go." Evelyn said the truth simple and naked, and because it was a place built for waiting. For what? She tightened her arms around Grace. For the hurt to stop, for the world to change its mind. Caleb nodded like a man who understood more than he said. They climbed a slope where big sage lay buried frosted shapes like sleeping animals. The sky pulled lower a pewter lid. Off to their right, a coyote barked the sound thin and lonely. "Coyotes won't bother us," Caleb said, though nobody had spoken the fear. "They sing to hear their own voices is all." Like the ladies at the general store, Clara muttered. Evelyn would have scolded her anywhere else. Here in the white, she only reached for the girl's hand and squeezed it once. A silent answer, "I heard it too. I always hear it." When the slope leveled, Caleb paused again and untied a small tin from his saddle strings. He poured a black ribbon of coffee into its lid, the steam curling like a promise. He handed it to Evelyn without comment, then passed the tin to Clara for a sip, then to Samuel and Ben one careful mouthful each. He did not drink himself until the tin had made its round and returned half empty. "You don't have to," Evelyn began. He lifted the tin, took a swallow, and capped it. "There's a pot on the stove at home." "Home." The word landed between them with the softest thud and still managed to echo. Evelyn kept walking. The skin at the corners of her eyes prickled. By the 4th mile, the wind came down in loose curtains, less angry, more persistent. The land rose into a shallow bench, and ahead a darker line cut the pale a stand of fir that had hidden all morning behind the storm. Beyond it, 2 rooftops took shape, the peaks rimmed in ice. The children saw it first. Ma Samuel cried from the saddle, twisting to look. "Is that a house?" Clara said, her voice reverent. "Barn, too," Caleb said. "Ranch is small, but it's honest. We'll get you dry then, see about a bath and a hot meal." Ben leaned forward against the horn. "Do you got a dog?" did Caleb said after a beat. "Old Murphy. Laughed like a drunk whenever I scratched his ribs. We'll see about a new pup come spring." They descended into a shallow hollow where the wind dropped away almost entirely, sheltered by the fir stand. Snow stacked on boughs like folded quilts. A hawk cried somewhere far off. Caleb's boots creaked on the packed path, a sound warmer than any fire to Evelyn's ears. The nearer roof belonged to a house built true straight walls, neat, chinking a porch deep enough to sit a family in summer. A curl of smoke climbed from the chimney blue-gray against the white. Caleb halted, untied Samuel and Ben, and set them down carefully. He rubbed their hands between his palms until color sputtered back into their fingers. Then he looked at Evelyn. "You'll go in first," he said. "Take the heat slow." Sometimes the body rebels against blessing. She almost laughed, an odd little sound rusty as a hinge. "I'll keep that in mind." He stepped onto the porch and opened the door. Heat rolled out, real heat, not just the absence of cold wrapped in the smells of wood smoke and stew and leather oil. Evelyn felt her knees threaten to fold. Pride caught them before they did. Inside, Caleb said gentler than any order she'd ever heard. The room was simple and clean. A cast-iron stove hunched in the corner like a black bear, its belly glowing. A long table stood beneath a window furred with frost, a row of tin cups lined up like soldiers. Shelves bore flour beans, a precious squat jar of sugar. A rocking chair waited near the stove with a knitted afghan folded square over its back. The sight of that blanket made Evelyn's throat close for reasons she could not have named. She lowered herself to the chair and eased Grace into her lap. The child uncurled as if she'd been a fist all winter and was finally allowed to open. Clara stood very still, hands clasped in front of her, as if she might break the room by touching it. Samuel and Ben drifted toward the stove, palms open to the radiant heat, faces tilted like flowers. Caleb hung his hat on a peg, shrugged out of his scarf, and reached for the kettle. He moved as he had in the storm without fuss, Without hurry, pouring hot water into a basin, laying out rough towels, setting a chipped mug on the table, and filling it halfway. He added a spoon of sugar without looking at them, as if sugar had never been a question. "Drink slow," he said, placing the mug in Evelyn's hands. She did. The sweetness lit a fuse down her spine. Warmth began to melt places she had forgotten she had. She blinked hard. "Rooms are down the hall," he said. "I've got linens. Clothes won't fit right, but we'll make do. We'll take turns with the tub so nobody gets chilled. After stew." Evelyn lifted her eyes. "Why?" The words slipped out, almost a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb didn't answer at once. He ladled stew into bowls and set them near the stove to keep warm. He sliced bread, his knife sure and quiet. When he turned, the lamplight found the lines at the corners of his mouth and eyes, the map of a life that knew both grief and grit. "Because no one should face a winter alone," he said. "Because I saw you sitting at that station and it didn't look like charity. It looked like a sin against the order of things." He paused, then added, "And because I can." Evelyn absorbed the words in pieces. No pity, no sermon, no question she would have to answer to earn her place by his fire, just because. She swallowed jaw tight. "Thank you," she said, the syllables heavier than the coat on her shoulders. Ben tugged at her skirt. "Mama, it's warm." "It is," she said, and stroked his hair. Caleb crouched by the stove and stoked the fire, sending sparks skipping up the flue. He did not look at her as he said, "You can stay a while. Rest. We'll figure the rest after." The storm complained at the windows, then seemed to think better of it. The house breathed around them. Evelyn let her weight sink into the rocker, the motion small and steady, the cadence of safety. She knew this was only a pause in the long march of troubles, knew the world had a way of collecting its debts, but for the span of a dozen heartbeats, she allowed the heat to untie the knots inside her. Grace slept. Samuel drowsed in a chair too big for him, feet not touching the floor. Clara stood watch at the window like a sentinel who had at last found a wall to guard. Evelyn watched Caleb move through his house, filling bowls, laying spoons, finding blankets. She did not know the shape of tomorrow, or what the town would say when they learned he'd brought a woman like her home. She only knew there was stew on the stove and fire in the belly of the room, and a man whose coat still held his warmth on her shoulders. It was a beginning, and beginnings are rare gifts in a winter like this. The house breathed with the crack and sigh of the stove warmth seeping into corners long claimed by cold. Evelyn sat rigid in the rocker, Grace asleep in her arms, the mug of sugared water empty on her knee. The heat was almost unbearable after days in the snow. Her skin prickled as though thawing could hurt worse than frostbite. Samuel had slipped sideways in his chair, head lolling against the armrest. His lips parted in gentle snores. Ben had curled up near the stove, his cheek pressed to the wooden floor like it was feather down. Clara stood tall but swayed on her feet, eyelids heavy, jaw tight with a child's stubborn fight against surrender. "Go on," Caleb said, his voice quiet but sure. He was folding blankets with the neatness of habit, stacking them in a soldier's square. "Beds are ready." Clara's eyes darted to Evelyn, hesitant. Evelyn nodded. The girl's shoulders dropped and she slipped down the hallway. Her footsteps light, careful. Caleb straightened. "I'll carry the boys." Evelyn stiffened. "They'll manage." But before she finished, he bent and lifted Samuel with the ease of a man handling fence rails. Samuel barely stirred, only mumbled and pressed his face to Caleb's chest. Caleb carried him down the hall, his boots thumping steady, then returned for Ben. When he set the boy on the second bed, he tucked the blanket close beneath his chin with a hand that seemed too large and weathered for such gentleness. Evelyn shifted Grace, preparing to rise. "I'll take her. You'll take her to bed, not to work," Caleb said firmly. "This is no night for pride." The words might have stung from another man, but his tone was calm, practical, without even a hint of condescension. Still, Evelyn lifted her chin. "I don't accept charity." Caleb paused by the doorway, the lamplight edging his shoulders. "Then don't. Think of it as a trade. You and yours bring life into this house. I provide shelter. It balances." Evelyn studied him. He didn't wait for an answer, only nodded once and left her to settle Grace in the last bed. The girl sighed in her sleep, curling small fists against the pillow. Evelyn smoothed her hair, whispering a prayer she hadn't dared voice in days. When she returned to the main room, Caleb was by the stove again, ladling stew into 2 bowls. He set one at the table. "Eat!" Evelyn's stomach twisted with hunger and resistance both. The smell of beef and onion of broth steeped deep with marrow nearly undid her. She sat and picked up the spoon, forcing herself to chew slowly, though her body wanted to devour it. Caleb ate across from her, not watching, not pushing. Silence filled the room, broken only by the clink of spoons and the hiss of logs collapsing in the stove. After a long while, Evelyn spoke, her voice thin. "You live here alone?" He nodded. 5 years, and before that, my wife Caleb said simply, "She died." Evelyn's hand tightened on the spoon. She knew better than to pry. Grief was a closed door, not hers to open. Yet something in the way he said it, plain, unsentimental, made her heart ache. The quiet stretched, but it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the kind that made room for another person's breath. Evelyn ate the last spoonfuls slowly, feeling the heaviness of food anchor her again to the world. When the bowl was empty, Caleb rose, collected it, and washed it at the basin. His movements were deliberate, no wasted effort. He set the bowl upside down on a cloth to dry, then stoked the stove once more. "You can take the rocker tonight," he said. "I'll sleep in the chair." "You don't have to." "I said I will." His tone carried finality, but not harshness. Evelyn's pride wanted to argue, but exhaustion overruled. She sank into the rocker, pulling Caleb's coat around her like a cocoon. The smell of leather and smoke clung to it. Her eyes closed, her body finally surrendering. Through the fog of sleep, she heard Caleb shift into the chair by the stove, the scrape of wood against wood. She thought she should thank him, but the word tangled on her tongue, and sleep claimed her before she could push it free. Morning broke pale through frost-laced windows. Evelyn stirred to the sound of boots on wood, a kettle whistling softly. She blinked, unsure at first if she was still in the storm. Then she saw the shelves lined with jars, the steady flame in the stove, the shadow of Caleb moving across the room. It was real. The children shuffled out of the back room, hair tousled, eyes heavy but brighter than they'd been in days. Caleb placed bread and apple slices on the table. "Eat up," Clara frowned. "Don't you want some?" "I've had mine," Caleb said. Evelyn knew he hadn't, but she didn't argue, not with the children watching. She urged them forward, and their small hands reached eagerly. Watching them chew, hearing their soft laughter, she felt tears prick her eyes. Caleb poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. "You'll need strength." She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the heat. "Strength for what?" "For whatever comes." The words landed heavy, carrying weight she couldn't yet name. That afternoon, Caleb brought her into the rhythm of the ranch. He showed Clara where to stack wood, guided Samuel through feeding the chickens, and let Ben scatter grain for the horses. Grace toddled at Evelyn's skirts, her cheeks pink with health returning. The work was small, but it was work, and it settled into Evelyn's bones like something she had lost and found again. But when she rode with Caleb into town for supplies, she felt the world's eyes sharpen. The general store's bell rang loud when they entered and conversations hushed. Mrs. Boone stood near the counter, her eyes narrowing. "Well," she said, her voice sweet with vinegar. "Some folks do land on their feet, even if they fall the hardest." Whispers coiled around the room. Evelyn's face burned. Her fingers clutched the basket so tight her knuckles whitened. Caleb's voice cut through steady level. "She's under my roof, under my protection. That's all anyone needs to know." The store fell silent. No one dared meet his gaze. Evelyn stood, frozen breath sharp in her chest. She had expected pity, scorn, dismissal, but not defense. Not like this. As they left, she glanced at Caleb. He didn't look back at her, only adjusted the reins, guiding the wagon steady on the rutted road. But the echo of his words lingered inside her, warming a place she thought had frozen solid. The wagon wheels groaned over frozen ruts as Caleb guided the team back toward the ranch. Evelyn sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. The sting of the townsfolk's whispers clung to her like smoke, but louder still was the echo of Caleb's words inside the store. "She's under my roof, under my protection. That's all anyone needs to know." No man had ever spoken that way on her behalf, not even her late husband. He had loved her in his own fashion, yes, but he had never challenged a room full of gossiping eyes. The defense had come swift and plain from Caleb, with no glance at her, no performance, just conviction like a fence post driven deep. The ride home passed in silence, save for the creak of the wagon and the horse's breath huffing white into the air. Evelyn's pride wanted to speak, to say, "You shouldn't have done that," but gratitude clogged her throat. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the gray sky pressed heavy against the land. At the ranch, the children tumbled from the wagon, shaking off the weight of town like dogs shedding rain. Clara helped Samuel carry the flour sack inside, while Ben darted after the hens. Grace clung to Evelyn's skirts, until Caleb stooped and lifted her easily, settling her against his chest with a patience that startled Evelyn. Grace looked up at him with solemn eyes, then rested her cheek on his shoulder, as though she had known him forever. Evelyn followed them inside her mind, spinning. She wanted to ask him why he would risk his own name for hers, why he'd taken them in without question. But when she opened her mouth, the words died. She wasn't ready for the answers, not yet. That night, after the children had settled into their beds and the fire was banked low, Evelyn sat in the rocker with her shawl wrapped tight. Caleb leaned against the mantel, his hat set aside, arms folded across his chest. The lamplight carved shadows along the lines of his face, making him look both older and stronger. "They'll talk more," Evelyn said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through words sharper than knives. Caleb nodded. "Let 'em." "You don't understand." Her voice cracked. "They say I'm cursed. They said I brought ruin on my husband's name. That I caused his death." Caleb's gaze sharpened, but his voice stayed steady. "And did you?" She flinched. The question was plain, not cruel, yet it struck deep. "No," she whispered. "I swear it. The debt collector came looking for money we never had. He goaded my husband into a fight. There was shouting, a gun went off. My husband fell before I could even reach him. When the sheriff arrived, it was too late, and instead of mourning with me, his family turned on me, said I'd curse their son, curse them all." Her breath hitched. "They threw me out before the ground even settled over his grave." For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. The wind rattled faintly at the shutters, and the fire cracked. Evelyn braced for judgment, for suspicion, for the tightening of a man's mouth when he believed the gossip. But Caleb only said, "That's all I need to know." Evelyn stared. "You believe me that easily?" "I don't see a liar," he said simply. "I see a woman keeping her children alive when the world decided not to. That tells me enough." Her eyes burned. She pressed her palms to her lap to stop them from trembling. "But the town won't believe it. They'll turn on you for helping me." Caleb's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. "I've worked this land too long to be moved by whispers. Let them talk. I'll keep doing what needs doing." The steadiness in his voice did something strange to Evelyn's chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest flicker of safety. Not certainty, not yet, but the idea that perhaps not everyone would abandon her when the wind grew harsh. Days turned into a rhythm. Evelyn mended clothes by the window while the children played in the yard. Caleb moved through the barn and fields with patient strength, his every task deliberate, from hammering a loose board to gentling a restless colt. She found herself watching him sometimes, her needle stilled in her hand. There was something about the way he never hurried, never wasted a step, that reminded her of steadiness she had thought gone from the world. Clara laughed again, her face bright as she carried eggs from the coop. Samuel found joy in brushing the horses, though the brush was nearly half his size. Ben followed Caleb like a shadow, asking endless questions about fence posts and nails. Grace toddled through the yard, her cheeks pink, her giggles carrying across the snow. For the first time since her exile, Evelyn's children looked like children again, not ghosts of hunger, but living, breathing, laughing souls. And yet at night, when the house quieted, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the rafters. Fear whispered that it couldn't last, that someone would knock on the door and tear it all away, that her shame would poison this house the way it had poisoned every place before. Her fears proved sharp one afternoon when Caleb sent her into town with Clara for fabric. The store bell rang, and every eye turned. Mrs. Boone stood behind the counter, lips curling. "Well, if it isn't the charity case," she said, her tone pitched loud enough for the other women to hear. Finding yourself comfortable under a rancher's roof, are you? Must be nice landing soft after ruining your husband. Heat surged up Evelyn's neck. Clara stiffened beside her, her small hand clenching around Evelyn's. Evelyn forced her chin up. I pay my way where I can. Mrs. Boone said, feigning sweetness. Strange how women like you always seem to find a way to survive. Makes folks wonder how. The words were poison wrapped in lace. Evelyn's breath caught her pride and shame warring inside her. Clara's eyes darted up to her wide and fearful. Evelyn wanted to crumble, but she straightened her voice, trembling yet strong. I survived because I have children who depend on me. That's all there is. The store quieted. For once, even Mrs. Boone faltered. Evelyn took her fabric, her hand steady as she paid. Then she turned, gathering Clara close, and walked out with her head high. But once outside, her knees weakened. Clara slipped an arm around her waist, whispering, You were brave, Mama. Evelyn forced a smile. Sometimes being brave just means not letting them see you cry. Still, as the wagon rattled back toward the ranch, Evelyn knew the battle with the town had only just begun. Morning came soft and pale, the kind of light that made frost look like lace. Evelyn tied her hair back with a scrap of blue ribbon Clara had found in a drawer and rolled her sleeves. The house had a heartbeat now. Boots by the door, a broom leaned just so, cups drying upside down like small tin bells. She kept the children to their tasks. Clara sweeping Samuel, fetching kindling, Ben sorting buttons into a tin, as if the right order could save the world. Grace toddled between them, all announcing each triumph stick button as if naming warmed a thing from the inside out. Caleb stepped in from the barn, shaking snow from his hat. Team's hitched, he said. Feed and salt. Stove polish if Boone's got any. Need nails from the blacksmith. Evelyn's hands paused on the flour sack. Part of her still flinched at the word town. It was only a cluster of buildings strung along a muddy street, but it could look like a gallows when the wrong eyes gathered. She breathed once slow. We'll go and be quick. Caleb's gaze held hers a moment, reading what she didn't say. Quick's good, he said, but we won't rush on anyone's account. They rode in the wagon, the iron-rimmed wheels groaning over frozen ruts. The sky had lifted to a clean, stinging blue. Sunlight threw a million sparks off the crusted drifts. Clara sat between them, chattering about spring seeds and whether hens liked music. Behind them, Samuel and Ben argued cheerfully about whether Murphy the dog who laughed like a drunk had ever really existed. Grace stood on the bench to look for birds, her mittened hands gripping the rail. Remember, Evelyn said, keeping her voice even, if someone speaks wrong, we don't feed it. We answer plain and move along. Yes, ma'am, Clara said, and her glance toward Caleb said she remembered yesterday's defense as clearly as the words still ringing in her mother's chest. Town grew from a smudge to a row of false fronts, the general store with its painted sign Boone's, the smithy with its squat soot-streaked roof, the church steeple a pure white stake against the sky. They rattled to a stop. The bell over Boone's door clanged as they entered, and once again conversation dipped. Mrs. Boone stood behind the counter like a queen on a mild day. Chin-high hair, coiled tight eyes that knew how to count and judge at the same time. Mr. Donovan, she said, as if tasting iron. Back so soon. Business needs don't keep a calendar, Caleb answered, laying a neat list on the counter. 2 sacks feed, salt 5 pounds, coffee, stove polish. And what for the lady? Mrs. Boone looked at Evelyn without turning her head, a neat trick that made the glance feel like a pin. Thread, Evelyn said evenly. And calico, if you've got a remnant bin. The children are growing out of their winter. Are they? Mrs. Boone flicked a look toward Clara, then back to Evelyn. Fortunate they found a roof to grow under. Evelyn held the woman's gaze. Fortunate, she said, and grateful. A man by the stove spit into the ash bucket. Grateful can be loud as gossip, he muttered. Grateful can mind its own business, Hank Caleb said, without turning. He set coins on the counter one by one, each clink like a nail-driven firm. We'll take the goods and go. Miss it. Boone measured the salt, weighed the coffee, then laid a row of thread spools like chess pieces. We don't keep charity, she said, and we don't extend credit to strangers with complicated histories. Evelyn felt Clara's hand graze hers, seeking and steady. We're paying, Evelyn said. In full. Mrs. Boone smiled a thin white smile. Of course. It might have ended there, just another small incision in a day of small wounds, if not for the door opening and two men stepping in stamping snow. Tom Whalen, who kept the livery, and Deacon Pratt, the sort of churchman who counted souls like beans. Whalen nodded to Caleb. Pratt's eyes went to Evelyn, then to Caleb, and sharpened. Morning, Pratt said. Word gets around faster than the wind. Folks say you've brought a widow and her brood to your place. Caleb stacked the coffee and salt on the counter. Folks' words travel too far for their feet. Is it true? Pratt asked. Caleb looked at him, then a slow, level look. You asking out of neighbor interest, Deacon, or for the minutes of your next meeting? A cheap laugh buzzed from the stove like a fly. Pratt colored. It's a small town. People are concerned where scandal might take root. Evelyn felt the blood humming in her ears. She could feel the old urge to shrink, to fold, to make herself small enough to pass unseen. She did not move. Caleb placed his hands flat on the counter. Scandal doesn't take root where work's being done and mouths are being fed. It blows through and then it blows on. Pratt's mouth compressed. We want to believe the best, Caleb. But there's talk. Talk always comes with a reason, Mrs. Boone cut in softly. Sometimes it's even true. The room held its breath. Caleb turned so the whole store could hear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This woman, Evelyn Harper, and her children are under my roof. He said the words clean as water on rock. Under my protection. Under my respect. If you speak ill of her, you speak ill of me. He let it land, then added, and I have long ears. Even the stove seemed to hush. Whalen scratched his cheek and looked at his boots. Pratt cleared his throat. Mrs. Boone found the sudden need to rearrange a jar of penny candy. Pastor Harrow, someone said, and a new figure filled the doorway, cheeks red from cold eyes, quick and kind. The pastor took in the room at a glance, from Caleb's squared shoulders to Evelyn's steady chin to the children peeking from behind the calico barrel. Caleb Pastor Harrow said warmth in the syllables. Mrs. Harper. Kids. He tipped his hat to each child in turn, and Grace, solemn with the seriousness of being seen, tipped her mitten back. Pastor Caleb said. Harrow's gaze slid to Pratt, then to Mrs. Boone, then back to Caleb. Sometimes a town needs a reminder that winter is harder on some than others, he said mildly, and that mercy's part of the tithe. Mrs. Boone's mouth primmed. Pratt found urgent interest in the hymn cards tacked by the door. Evelyn hadn't realized she'd been bracing until she felt something give in her spine. Not collapse, just the easing that comes when a weight shifts from one shoulder to two. Thank you, Pastor, she said, and her voice did not shake. Harrow smiled at her, then at Clara. There's warm bread cooling at the parsonage, he said. If you find your way past, I'll forget to lock the back door. We'll remember, Caleb said. They paid and left the bell clanging their exit. Outside, the sun had climbed to a hard, bright height. Caleb loaded the wagon without comment. Evelyn lifted the calico bolt and the thread and tucked them close as if fabric could guard against words. They crossed toward the smithy for nails. Inside, heat rolled like a great animal. Sparks leapt from the anvil where the blacksmith Duffy O'Shaughnessy hammered a horseshoe into shape. He looked up and grinned, iron tongs in hand. Caleb, he boomed, and you've brought spring with you. Look at those little faces. He winked all around, unbothered by tension lingering in the street. What's needed, Nails, Caleb said. Good ones. And a promise you won't sell me crooked heads like last time. Duffy snorted. A man makes one bad batch and hears about it till his funeral. He reached for a keg, muscled it up, and dropped it by the door. Half price to make amends to your pride. Fair at full, Caleb said. We'll take them square. He slid the coins across. Evelyn watched the exchange, the honest trade of respect for respect, and something about it burned her eyes. She blinked it away. When they climbed back into the wagon, Pastor Harrow was at the church gate fussing with a hinge that didn't need fussing. He called service on Sunday, Caleb. If you happen to have guests, I suppose the Lord won't mind. We'll see, Caleb said. Harrow's eyes softened as he looked at Evelyn. We always see. Sometimes that's enough. They rattled out of town, and the sound of their wheels on the hard road tasted like freedom. The children's chatter dammed up in the store burst its banks. Clara about growing hollyhocks, Samuel about the hammer's music, Ben about whether the pastor's bread would truly forget to be locked. Grace fell asleep against Evelyn's side, mouth open, mitten limp. Evelyn watched the town shrink in the wagon's wake. It didn't look like a gallows now, more like a place that contained both sharpened tongues and decent men, which is to say most places. She breathed in, filled her lungs, held it, let it go. You didn't have to say it that way, she said after a while, eyes on the horizon. Under my name. Caleb kept the reins easy. Folks in a dry country understand fences and names. He glanced at her. I didn't mean a claim, only a line other people can see. Evelyn considered that. I've been claimed and cast out so many times I can't tell the difference anymore. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The road unspooled before them, bright and cold. Back at the ranch, the air smelled of cedar smoke and horse. Caleb hauled the feed and nails to the barn. Evelyn stacked the coffee and salt on the shelf, lined the thread spools in a row that pleased her eye. When she turned, Clara stood in the doorway, watching her with a look that belonged to someone a little older than 10. He said your name like it was a shield, Clara said. Evelyn reached out and smoothed the ribbon in her daughter's hair. He did, she said. And we don't hide behind shields forever. But today I was glad for the shade. Clara nodded solemnly and went to fetch the broom. Late afternoon found them on the porch steps, the sun sliding down the sky like a coin dropping into a slot. Caleb sat with his elbows on his knees, watching the shadows lengthen. Evelyn brought him a tin mug coffee, gone thin but still warm. He took it without looking, sipped, then handed it back. The pastor, she began. Has a good nose for trouble, Caleb finished, and a better one for Grace. They sat a long time without speaking. The children's voices rose and fell in the yard. A hawk crossed the high blue, a clean stroke of wing and will. Thank you, Evelyn said at last softly. For the store. For all of it. Caleb didn't turn his head. Don't mention it. I already did, she said, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. He huffed something that might have been a laugh. The wind shifted and brought the smell of snow again, as if to remind them winter still had a say. Evelyn pulled the shawl tighter. Inside, after the lamps were lit and the day was put away, Evelyn lay awake a while listening to the tick of cooling iron, the creak that always came from the third stair, the small sighs of sleeping children. The town had teeth, but so did mercy. She felt both marks on her skin. When at last she drifted, it was with the sense of a line drawn visible sturdy, the kind that kept more out than in. In the morning, there would be chores and bread and laughter, and surely more talk from town. But the day had carried a truth she could hold to some name, stop the wind at the door. And with that thought, sleep took her and the house breathed along. The snow had softened in the days that followed, crust giving way to slush the air, carrying the faint tang of earth beneath. Evelyn felt the shift in her bones, less the bite of survival, more the dull ache of living. Each morning began with chores, feeding chickens, sweeping floors, coaxing the children to scrub hands raw with lye soap. Each evening ended with Caleb's steady tread through the rooms, checking shutters, banking the fire, the sound of a man making sure the world stayed intact until morning. Evelyn moved through the house like someone learning a new song. Her hands found rhythm in mending shirts, chopping carrots for stew, hanging damp laundry near the stove. The children laughed again, their voices threading through the air like music. Samuel whittled a stick with Caleb's old knife, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ben followed Caleb everywhere, asking questions that spilled out faster than they could be answered. Clara had begun humming when she swept a soft tune Evelyn didn't recognize but loved just the same. Even Grace, once curled silent with hunger now, toddled across the floor, clutching a wooden spoon like a scepter. And yet Evelyn's heart held a knot. Every kindness she accepted, every bowl of stew, every blanket, every steady look from Caleb tightened the knot further. Gratitude wrestled pride. Fear shadowed hope. What if it all collapsed? What if the world which had never allowed her joy without penalty came to collect again? One afternoon, she stood at the window needle, stilling in her hand. Outside, Caleb hammered a loose fence board near the corral. Snow clung to his boots, his shoulders bent into the work. Each swing of the hammer was deliberate, strong, and unhurried. He did not fidget or curse the cold. He simply set the nail Drew back and struck. Evelyn watched him longer than she meant to, her heart slowing to the rhythm of his patience. Mama Clara's voice broke her spell. The girl had paused in the doorway holding a bucket of kindling. Her eyes were sharp for 10 years old. Are you happy here?" The question startled Evelyn more than any gossip. She hesitated, then knelt to take the bucket from her daughter's hands. "I'm trying to be." "Mr. Donovan's kind," Clara said. Her tone was cautious, like testing ice, kinder than Grandpa ever was. Evelyn's throat tightened. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Clara's cheek. "Not all men are cruel, Clara. Some just carry the world differently." Clara nodded slowly, as though cataloging the thought for later. Then she smiled faintly, as if it were a relief. That evening, the family ate stew together at the long wooden table. Caleb sat at the far end, his presence filling the room even when he spoke little. Grace climbed onto his knee halfway through the meal, smearing broth across his sleeve with her spoon. He only chuckled low, steadying her with one hand while finishing his own bowl with the other. The children's laughter rose warm around the table, and for a fleeting moment, Evelyn forgot the weight of whispers outside these walls. After supper, Caleb stacked wood by the stove while Evelyn washed bowls. She found herself speaking before she'd thought it through. "You've given us more than I can repay." Caleb didn't glance up. "It isn't a debt, it feels like one. Then think of it as work traded for work. You keep this house running cleaner than I ever did. You've made the children laugh in these rooms." He set down the wood and straightened his gray eyes, meeting hers. "That's worth more than coin." Evelyn gripped the dishcloth, her chest tight. "You don't know what people will say. What they already say." His mouth twitched. "I've heard worse. Talk is cheap. Truth costs something. I'm paying for truth, not for their chatter." The words pressed deep. She dropped her gaze, unable to hold his steady eyes for long. The next Sunday, Pastor Harrow's bell tolled across the frozen town. Evelyn had not stepped into a church since before her husband's death. Shame had kept her out. The sideways glances, the whispered prayers meant more for ears than heaven. Caleb hitched the team and asked nothing, only helped the children climb in, adjusting their mittens. Evelyn followed her heart, drumming with dread. Inside the church, the congregation turned as they entered. Evelyn felt the familiar heat crawl up her neck. Mrs. Boone sat stiff in the front pew, her back straight as a fence post. Deacon Pratt tilted his chin lips pressed thin, but the pastor greeted them with warmth, guiding the children to sit, shaking Caleb's hand firmly. The sermon was on mercy, that it was not a weakness, but a weight we carried together. Evelyn listened, her breath shallow, waiting for the pointed glance the sermon sharpened into accusation. It never came. Instead, Pastor Harrow looked at her directly when he said, "Mercy doesn't ask what you've done. It asks what you'll do now." Afterward, Clara darted to the front, curious about the hymnals. Samuel and Ben followed, inspecting the altar candles. Evelyn lingered at the pew, clutching Grace, feeling the weight of a dozen eyes. Caleb stood beside her, steady as stone. "They'll keep watching," she whispered. "Then let 'em see," he murmured back. The ride home was quiet, but the silence felt different, not heavy but bracing, like breath drawn before speaking something true. That night, Evelyn lay awake again, listening to the steady tick of cooling iron. She thought of Caleb's words, at the store of his patience, at the fence of the way he carried Grace without hesitation. She thought of the world's cruelty and of mercy's weight. Somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and the scars, hope stirred like the first thaw under ice. Still, she knew hope was dangerous. It could be stripped away with a word, a knock at the door, a reminder that the past never stays buried. She pressed her hands to her heart, as if she could keep it still, as if she could hold spring back until she was ready to believe in it. But outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere far off, water began to run beneath the snow. The thaw came in slow whispers, snowmelt trickling off the eaves, damp earth breathing through the drifts, the faint scent of pine cutting through the smoke of the stove. Evelyn tried to let the change settle in her bones, but her heart carried the uneasy rhythm of a hunted thing. For every day that brought warmth, she felt the weight of what might follow. It was late afternoon when Caleb was working the corral fence, his hammer echoing like a clock in the yard. Evelyn watched from the porch as the children played Clara, chasing Ben with a stick horse, Samuel tugging Grace in a wooden crate, pretending it was a wagon. For a moment, she almost smiled. Then a sound cut through the calm hoofbeats, steady and deliberate, coming up the road. Evelyn's breath caught. She knew that sound, the cadence of a rider who wasn't passing through but coming with intent. Caleb straightened, setting the hammer aside. The figure appeared, a lean man on a chestnut horse coat, worn hat brim low. As he drew close, Evelyn's stomach dropped. She knew his face. Frank Denton. He had been there the night her husband died. Not close enough to intervene, but close enough to see. His eyes, sharp and too curious, had burned into her memory. She rose from the porch steps, her hands trembling. "Ma'am," Denton said, tipping his hat with a mock politeness. His voice carried the slow drawl of a man who liked to taste his words before spitting them out. "Been a while." Evelyn gripped the porch rail. "What do you want?" Caleb stepped between them, his shoulders broad, his voice flat. "You've come a long way, friend. Say your piece and move on." Denton leaned forward on the saddle horn, eyes flicking from Evelyn to the children, then back. "Word gets around. Folks say the widow Harper found herself a soft landing. Warm fire, full belly, strong back to keep her safe. Makes a man wonder how truth got twisted so fast." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "Truth doesn't change." Denton's mouth curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Depends on who's telling it. Some say you knew more than you let on. About the money, about why that debt collector bled out on the dirt." The words hit her like cold water. Clara froze by the crate, clutching Grace's hand. Samuel's face paled, his whittling knife slipping from his fingers. Even Ben, too young to understand fully, sensed the poison in the air. "That's a lie," Evelyn said sharply, her voice louder than she meant. "Maybe." Denton shrugged as if the matter weighed nothing. "But lies have legs, and these ones run faster than the truth." Caleb's jaw worked. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between Evelyn and Denton. "You've said your piece. Now ride." For a moment, Denton looked as though he might press further. His eyes lingered on Evelyn, a flash of something cruel there. But then he touched his hat again, turned his horse, and trotted back down the road, leaving hoofprints like scars in the mud. The silence afterward was louder than the hammer strikes had been. Evelyn's knees felt weak. She turned and saw the children staring at her, their eyes wide with questions. Clara spoke first, her voice trembling. "Mama, is it true? What he said?" Evelyn's chest ached. She wanted to shield them, to sweep the words away like dust, but their faces begged for something real. She knelt, pulling them close, her voice shaking. "No, it isn't. Your father made a mistake that night, but I never lied. I never hid anything. Do you hear me?" Clara nodded, tears welling. Samuel swallowed hard. Ben only clung to her skirt. Grace whimpered, confused by the sudden heaviness in the air. Caleb laid a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, steadying her. His voice was low, meant for her alone. "Don't give his poison more ground than it already has." Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes burning. "They'll believe him. They always believe men like him." Caleb's face was granite, but his eyes softened. "Then we'll give them a better truth to see." That night, Evelyn could not sleep. She sat in the rocker with Grace in her lap, watching the fire burn low. Her thoughts churned Denton's sneer, the children's frightened eyes, the way Caleb's hand had felt on her shoulder, solid, unshaken. She feared Denton's words would spread faster than she could chase them, that Caleb would one day see her through the same eyes as the town. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice came from the chair near the stove. "Tell me everything." Evelyn blinked. "What?" "The night your husband died. The debt. All of it. Tell me straight." She swallowed hard. Her fingers curled into Grace's blanket. Then, with a trembling breath, she began. She told him about the debt collector who came demanding money she never saw, about her husband's temper, about the fight that spilled into blood. She told him how her in-laws turned their grief into blame, how they branded her cursed, how the town echoed it until she had no place left to stand. Her voice broke, but she pushed the words out anyway, laying bare the scars she had carried alone. When she finished, the silence in the room felt like judgment waiting to fall. Caleb didn't speak at once. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the fire. Then he said with the same steady certainty he'd used at the store, "That's all I need to know." Evelyn's throat tightened. "You believe me." He looked at her then, gray eyes unwavering. "I've seen liars. You don't wear the face of one. And even if you did, you've carried 4 children through hell. That truth weighs more than his lies ever could. The knot in Evelyn's chest loosened a fraction. She pressed her lips to Grace's hair, closing her eyes against the hot tears. For the first time since the station, she felt the faintest flicker of something dangerous trust. The next morning broke with a sky the color of tarnished silver. The thaw had slowed overnight, a crust of ice sealing the slush, every hoofprint and wagon rut preserved sharp as scars. Evelyn stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of weak coffee, watching Caleb stride across the yard toward the barn. His shoulders were squared, his movements deliberate, as if Frank Denton's visit had left him thinking as much as it had left her unsettled. Behind her, the children stirred. Clara coaxed Samuel and Ben to wash before breakfast, her voice firm, mimicking her mother's tone. Grace toddled to the hearth with her rag doll plopping down with a sigh, as if even at 3 years old she understood that life required pauses of weariness. Evelyn turned back to the stove, stirring porridge that smelled faintly of cinnamon. The rhythm of the spoon scraping the pot steadied her heart, but inside she was still unraveling. Denton's words had landed like a spark in dry grass. Rumor was quick truth slower, and a man like Caleb, who had given them warmth, food safety, might one day decide that the weight of her past was too heavy to carry. When Caleb returned brushing frost from his coat, she faced him across the kitchen table. The children ate in silence, sensing the tension. Finally, she set her spoon aside. "You asked me to tell you the truth. I did. But the town won't listen, Caleb. They'll believe Denton before they ever believe me." He poured coffee into a tin cup and said calmly, "Then they'll have to decide if their gossip is worth more than their word. I'll not live my life by their tongues." "You'll lose business," she pressed. "They'll boycott your cattle. They'll whisper until even your friends turn away." Caleb's eyes lifted gray as storm clouds, but steady. "Let them. I've weathered worse storms than a pack of wagging tongues." His certainty might have reassured her if not for the ache of fear inside her chest. She looked down at her hands, the skin cracked from soap and cold. "I can't be the reason you lose everything." He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You're not a reason for loss. You're the reason this house feels like a home again." Her breath caught. The words sank deep, frightening in their tenderness. She had long ago forgotten what it felt like to be seen not as a burden, but as something worthy. By afternoon, she tried to shake off the weight. There was work to be done, and work always steadied her. She gathered Clara and Samuel to help mend a tear in the chicken coop. Ben followed Caleb into the barn, tugging on his sleeve, peppering him with questions about bridles and saddles. Grace toddled after Evelyn, her laugh carrying like a bell. When they returned to the house, Evelyn found a folded scrap of paper tucked under the door. She froze, heart hammering. Caleb opened it with a quick glance. The handwriting was crude, the message short. "Send the widow packing or share her curse." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She reached for the note, but Caleb folded it in his hand, jaw hard. "Don't," he said. "This isn't yours to carry alone." "But it is," she whispered fiercely. "They hate me, Caleb. They'll never stop. If I leave, they'll leave you in peace." He stepped closer, his height casting her in shadow. His voice was quiet but edged with steel. "You're not leaving. If they want to come after someone, let it be me. I won't see you thrown to the wolves again." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but fear clawed at her ribs. The past had taught her too many times that men's promises could break. That night she sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. Caleb worked silently at the table, mending a saddle strap with slow, practiced hands. The air between them was thick with unsaid things. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice low. "Do you know what it feels like? To have people look at you and see nothing but blame?" He didn't look up from the strap. "I know what it feels like to be judged for things you couldn't change. My wife died of fever, and folks said I hadn't prayed hard enough, said I was cursed too." His hand stilled the leather limp in his fingers. "I learned to stop listening." Evelyn blinked. "They said that about you?" "A man alone makes an easy target." He met her gaze, eyes shadowed by memory. "Same as a woman with children." The room was quiet but for the hiss of the fire. She studied him, realizing she was not the only one carved by loss. He carried his scars differently, quieter, but they were there all the same. Evelyn drew a slow breath. "I don't know how to thank you. You already did," Caleb said, his voice even. "You told me the truth." The next morning, Pastor Harrow rode up on his bay mare coat, flapping in the wind. He greeted the children first, tipping his hat to Grace until she giggled. Then he dismounted, his face grave. "There's talk in town," he said to Caleb. "Denton's stirring it. Folks whisper that Evelyn's husband died over money that was never found. Some believe she's hiding it. They're saying you'll be ruined if you keep her here." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "I told you I never saw a cent. There was nothing to hide." Pastor Harrow's eyes softened. "I believe you. But the town—" He shook his head. "The town likes a story, especially one with a villain they can point to." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then they'll have to find another villain. Because she stays." The pastor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I'll stand with you. But be ready. This won't quiet down on its own." As Harrow rode away, Evelyn felt Caleb's steady presence beside her. The storm she had feared was no longer at the door. It was here. And though she wanted to run to spare him, part of her clung to the truth he had spoken. "You're the reason this house feels like a home again." For the first time, she wondered if she could believe it. She found the answer the next morning when Caleb hitched the team with a determination that put iron in the air. Frost feathered the window panes. The sky held a clean, hard blue that made every edge on earth look honest. Evelyn tied Grace's bonnet, smoothed Samuel's hair, straightened Ben's collar, and checked Clara's ribbon twice. Caleb pulled on his coat and nodded toward the door, as if the decision had already been living there, waiting to be spoken aloud. "We're going to town," he said. Evelyn's stomach fluttered. "For what?" "For the same things we always go for. Nails, flour, stove polish." He paused, eyes steady on hers. "And because we don't hide." The children piled into the wagon, small boots thumping, wood breath pluming white. Evelyn climbed up last. Caleb offered his hand, not just for balance, but as a statement, and did not let go when she sat. He kept her hand in his warm through the glove until the horses leaned into the traces and the wheels climbed out of the yard. Then he settled their joined hands on his knee as if the road itself might draw strength from the simple fact of touch. Fields slid by, patched with bare ground where snow had thinned to nothing. Fence wires singing softly in the wind. The town rose from the plain in its row of false fronts and honest smoke. The bell over Boone's gave its dull clang when they stepped inside. Conversation hitched, then slowed like a team feeling a grade steepen. Mrs. Boone stood at the counter arranging spools of thread, as if color itself could be counted and controlled. Deacon Pratt lingered near the pickle barrel, sucking his teeth. A handful of men crowded the stove. Waylon from the livery. Hank, whose spit never missed the ash bucket. Two ranch hands Evelyn didn't know by name. She felt their glances like grit on her skin. Caleb did not falter. He removed his hat, set it on the counter beside the list he had brought, and then with a small turn that felt larger than a shout, he offered his arm to Evelyn. She slid her hand into the crook of his elbow. He straightened, and in that simple posture she felt herself pulled from the edges to the center, from the weather to the house. Morning. Mrs. Boone said the word as sharp as a pin. Back again. Trade keeps a town alive, Caleb answered. 2 sacks flour, 10 pounds beans, coffee sugar stove polish. And he looked to Evelyn. Calico, she said, willing her voice level. If you've remnants, I can make dresses from what's left of winter. Mrs. Boone's gaze moved over Evelyn like a cold hand. Remnants are cheaper for good reason, she said. Things made of them don't last. Some things do, Caleb said mildly. Put the good yardage on the counter, the blue there, and thread to match. Hank by the stove made a noise like a man catching a fish, half surprise, half sly delight. Deacon Pratt cleared his throat. Mr. Donovan, the congregation has concerns. A woman taken in without arrangements. Children underfoot. The appearance of Caleb turned, still offering Evelyn his arm, so she didn't have to release it even to pivot. He didn't raise his voice. If the church is counting appearances, it's doing figures the Lord never asked for. He looked from face to face, letting his gaze rest just long enough to show he recognized each man and would recognize him again. Listen plain. This woman, Evelyn Harper, and her children are under my roof, under my protection, under my respect. You speak ill of her, you speak ill of me. He let the words land, then added softer. And I don't forget the sound of a man's voice when he chooses who to be. Silence wavered, then steadied. Wayland's eyes dropped. Hank studied his boots like they were scripture. Mrs. Boone's mouth flattened until it nearly vanished. Deacon Pratt tried to find his dignity and came up with only his cough. The door opened. Cold slipped in. Pastor Harrow filled the threshold, cheeks pinked by the wind, eyes bright. He looked at the room and seemed to move the temperature by a degree simply by smiling. "Morning," he said, and tipped his hat to Evelyn. "Mrs. Harper." He glanced at the children lined like small, solemn sparrows near the counter. "You all behaving better than the grown-ups," Grace nodded fiercely. The store chuckled despite itself. Pastor Pratt began relief, sharpening his tone. We were merely buying flour," Harrow said, unbothered, and reminding ourselves that gossip is a sin with very fast feet. He moved to the counter, picked up the very bolt of blue calico Caleb had indicated, and unrolled it with a practiced flick. "For a house full of winter turning to spring," he said, measuring out yards with a generosity that made Mrs. Boone wince. Mrs. Boone found her voice. "It isn't the church's place." "It is precisely the church's place to practice mercy," Harrow said, still mild. "And the town's place to remember who they were the last time they were hungry." Mrs. Boone's knuckles whitened on the shears. But she cut the calico, counted the beans, weighed the sugar, and stacked goods with crisp, expert hands. Coins slid from Caleb's palm one by one, each clink, a nail set, and struck. Evelyn stood beside him, chin lifted. She looked at faces that had cut her before and did not drop her eyes. Shame had a way of bending the spine. Dignity put a board back in it. They gathered their parcels and stepped outside into the bright cold. Sun glittered on the packed snow in the street. A hawk traced a dark line across the blue. Caleb didn't let her disengage. He kept her hand where it lay neat as a promise. Across the way, Duffy O'Shaughnessy, the blacksmith, emerged from his forge, face smoked and shining. "Caleb," he boomed, wiping his hands on a rag that left them no cleaner. His eyes dropped to Evelyn's arm and Caleb's, then returned to her face with something like respect. "Ma'am." He nodded to the children. "You lot keeping him in line," trying Samuel said, and Duffy's laugh rolled out into the street, harmless as a big dog. They crossed to the smithy for nails. Inside, the air throbbed with heat and hammer song. Duffy shook nails into a sack, then leaned across the counter. "Heard a piece of foolishness this morning," he said. "Figured I'd tell it to the anvil so it'd ring right out of town. Should be gone by supper." He winked at Evelyn. "Sometimes sound can drive sound away." "I'm counting on it," Caleb said. When they came out, Deacon Pratt had gathered himself like a man preparing to take medicine. He stood a few feet off the hat in his hand. "Mrs. Harper," he said stiffly. "I spoke out of turn." Evelyn waited. She'd learned that silence could be as heavy as speech. Pratt flushed. "I don't know all that happened to you. I do know these children look fed and happy." He glanced at the small faces, then back to her. "The church women are baking the Lenten loaves this week. I'll see that one finds its way to your table." Something in Evelyn, some small crushed part, sat up wary. Mercy had teeth too. She had been bitten by it before. But she inclined her head. "Thank you," she said, careful with the words, as if they might break. They loaded the wagon. Evelyn lifted the sack of flour. Caleb took it from her and stowed it, not as if she couldn't, but as if he didn't have to prove anything by letting her strain. He steadied Clara as she climbed, unnecessary perhaps, but done anyway. Pastor Harrow ambled over, pretended to adjust the hitch, said to no one in particular, "What a fine day for a stubborn town to learn something." "Will it?" Evelyn asked before she could stop herself. Harrow's gaze warmed. "Towns learn like people do, slow with backsliding. But they do learn given a teacher with patience." He looked at Caleb. "And a spine. Plenty of both here," Caleb said. They rolled away. Hooves clopped the rhythm of a heart that had finally remembered how to keep time. The children's voices loosened, running ahead of the wagon. Samuel arguing that the hawk was the same one from last week. Ben insisting it was a different hawk, with better manners Clara, planning where the blue calico would fall in her new dress. Grace leaned against Evelyn's arm, thumb, and mouth, looking grandly satisfied to have supervised so important a morning. Evelyn watched the storefront slide by. Windows that had once reflected her back distorted and small. Now threw her a different image, one framed by the unwavering line of Caleb's shoulder and the calm of Pastor Harrow's nod. She thought of Denton's sneer and felt its edge dull just a fraction. Words made wounds, yes, but sometimes other words said clean, said publicly stitched something back together. At the last building, the livery Tom Whalen stepped into the street. "Caleb," he called. "Got that harness fixed. Bring your team by when you've a mind." "Will do," Caleb said. Whalen's eyes slid to Evelyn. He touched 2 fingers to his hat brim. "Ma'am?" It was not warm, not yet, but it was not a sneer. Sir Evelyn said, and let the single syllable carry what dignity would allow. The prairie opened, the town shrinking behind them into smoke and boards. Wind ran its cold fingers through the horses' manes. Caleb blew out a breath he'd held for an hour. Evelyn realized she had been holding the same one and let it go. The road lifted toward the ridge. The wagon creaked and climbed. "You didn't have to do it like that," she said, eyes on the horizon. "Had to," he answered. "Men like Pratt and Boone and whatever man Denton runs errands for work in the edges. They thrive where things are kept small and private. I prefer a wide street." She turned her head. "And what does a wide street cost?" He thought a moment. "A little pride. A little peace. But it buys a kind of quiet we can sleep in." He flicked the reins. "You walked into that store with me on your arm, and the room had to decide what they were seeing. Not a scandal, not a charity, a fact." Evelyn looked at their joined hands, at the neat drape of her wrist and the crook of his coat. Fact. The word steadied like a stone under her boot. At the ranch, the afternoon light slanted gold across the snow and turned the barn boards the color of old honey. Caleb carried in the heavy sacks. Evelyn set the calico on the table and smoothed it flat, palm lingering on the blue, as if color itself could answer the question rising in her chest. Clara stood beside her, eyes wide. "It's pretty," the girl breathed. "Pretty like a sky you can touch." Evelyn laughed, small, surprised, real. "Then we'll sew a little sky into your dress." Caleb came in and halted, a heartbeat at the sight mother and daughter heads bent over a promise of cloth. Something moved in his face that he masked by setting the flower on the shelf. "Supper'll be good," he said, purely to have words. They ate with the windows graying at the edges. After the bowls were cleared, after the children had tramped down the hall and the stove had been banked, Evelyn stepped onto the porch. The air cut clean into her lungs. Above the dark line of fir stars pricked through the last wash of dusk, Caleb joined her hands in his pockets, boots taking the weight of the boards like he trusted them. They stood without speaking a while. "I kept my head up in there," she said finally, voice low. "I thought I couldn't. But I did. I knew you would." "How?" He shrugged, a small, almost shy motion for a man his size. "Because you've been keeping it up since the station. Today just gave you a room full of witnesses." She absorbed that. The knot behind her ribs made of shame and habit, and 1,000 cutting looks eased just enough to let breath move without scraping. "Thank you." He shook his head. "Trade," he said softly. "You brought life back into these rooms." Inside, Grace laughed in her sleep. A late coyote yipped out on the flats. Another answered, thin and fierce. The sound didn't scare Evelyn tonight. It sounded like a declaration, "I'm here. I'm here." She wrapped Caleb's coat tighter around her shoulders and let the chill touch her face, one honest thing speaking to another. The road ahead still held trouble. She felt it thrumming out there the way you felt a train coming through iron long before you heard the whistle. But now the trouble would have to come to a house that had been named to a woman whose head no longer found the floor first, and to a man who had told a town exactly where he stood. When she went back inside, she left the door open a moment longer than necessary, as if to invite the night to learn its manners on the threshold. The weeks that followed held a quiet rhythm, as though the house itself was relearning how to breathe. The snow receded in jagged patches, earth steaming where the sun lingered, fence posts dark with thaw. Evelyn rose each morning to the hiss of the kettle, the creak of Caleb's boots crossing the porch. The children grew stronger, color back in their cheeks, laughter in their voices. Grace toddled through the kitchen with her doll. Samuel carried wood like a boy already leaning toward manhood. Ben chased chickens with unshakable determination, and Clara began keeping a notebook of little stories, her pencil scratching in the evenings by lamplight. Yet Evelyn herself carried two weights, gratitude and fear. Every kindness Caleb offered steadied her, but each also tightened the knot of dread inside. What if it all came undone? What if the town's whispers sharpened again, or Denton returned with poison on his tongue? She could not bear the thought of her children losing the first safe place they'd known since her husband's death. One afternoon, she found herself at the window again. Caleb was in the yard, sleeves rolled, mending harness leather. His movements were unhurried, patient, each tug of the all purposeful. He did everything that way without waste, without vanity. Watching him, Evelyn felt her chest ease, her heartbeat falling into rhythm with the steady pace of his hands. The screen door creaked. Clara slipped out onto the porch, book clutched in her arms. "Mama," she whispered, though Caleb was too far to hear. "He's good to us." Evelyn stroked her daughter's hair. "Yes, he is." "You trust him?" Clara asked softly. Evelyn hesitated. The truth tangled in her throat. "I want to." Clara's eyes were older than 10 should allow. "I think he wants us here." She pressed the book to her chest and darted back inside, leaving Evelyn with the words echoing like a promise she hadn't dared to name. That evening, the house smelled of stew and bread. Caleb sat at the head of the table, Grace perched on his knee, her tiny spoon clattering against the rim of her bowl. Samuel chattered about fixing the chicken coop. Ben announced that he was going to be a rancher, just like Mr. Donovan and Clara read aloud a short piece she'd written about the sound of the creek thawing. Caleb listened with a faint smile, nodding once when she finished, as if her words were worth as much as any man's ledger. After the children had gone to bed, Evelyn lingered at the sink scrubbing bowls until her hands ached. Caleb stood by the fire working a whetstone along his knife with slow, measured strokes. The silence pressed between them until she finally spoke. "I don't understand," she said quietly. He glanced up. "Understand why you're doing this, why you've taken us in. You've given us food, a roof, safety. You've stood against your own town for us." "Why?" Caleb set the knife aside, the firelight catching the planes of his face. He crossed to the table and leaned against it, arms folded. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Because no one should have to weather winter alone. And because when I saw you at that station, it wasn't pity I felt. It was wrongness. A world out of order. Putting it right was the only thing that made sense." Evelyn swallowed hard. And now his gaze didn't waver. "Now, I don't want you here just for the winter. I want you here because this is where you belong." Her heart jolted. She searched his face for jest, for pity, for any trace of obligation. There was none, only a quiet conviction that made her knees weak. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "I know exactly what I'm saying." The fire cracked, throwing sparks up the chimney. Evelyn's hands trembled around the dishcloth. For years she had been cast out, blamed, shamed, made small. Now a man was standing before her, not offering rescue, but something harder. Something that terrified and steadied her all at once, belonging. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "If you tie yourself to me, you'll carry my shame." Caleb stepped closer. His voice was low, certain. "Shame doesn't stick where there's truth. And I know your truth." The room seemed to tilt around her. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she fought them back. She had learned too well that tears never bought mercy. Yet standing there, the warmth of the fire wrapping them both, she felt the first stirrings of something she had thought long dead hope. Later, when the children were asleep, Evelyn found herself on the porch, the stars sharp above the dark trees. Caleb stepped out beside her, his presence filling the night like a shield. They stood in silence for a long moment before he spoke. "Winter's nearly gone," he said, "but I don't want you thinking that means you've got to go with it." Her breath caught. She gripped the porch rail to steady herself. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll stay. Not as a guest, not as a burden, as part of this house, as part of me." The night seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn turned her face toward him, her eyes shining in the starlight. She couldn't speak, not yet, but she didn't turn away. Caleb's hand rested lightly over hers on the rail, warm and certain. The silence between them was not empty. It was a beginning. The question lingered between them, heavy as the night air. Caleb's hand was warm on hers, steady as oak, but Evelyn's heart rattled in her chest like a loose shutter in the wind. No man had ever asked her to stay, not without condition, not without suspicion. She had been cast out by her in-laws, whispered about by neighbors, eyed with pity and scorn in every store. And now this man, quiet and unyielding as stone, was offering her a place. She couldn't answer right away. Her voice betrayed her trembling when she finally said, "You don't know what you're asking." "I do." Caleb's gaze was unflinching. "I'm asking you to be here, not until the thaw, not until the town finds a new story to chase. For good." Her throat ached. "You'd take me on with all the weight I carry, with the whispers, the curses, the past." His jaw worked once, the only sign of the weight he bore too. "I've carried worse, and none of it ever gave me the look in my house I see now. You and those children, you've brought life back into walls I thought would echo forever." The words cracked something inside her, something she had buried deep. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stop the sob threatening to escape. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He only waited. At last she whispered, "Yes." The wedding was small, quiet, and brimming with a kind of warmth Evelyn thought she'd never know again. Pastor Harrow stood beneath the church's low rafters, the winter light streaming through frosted panes. The children wore their Sunday best, Clara in the dress Evelyn had pieced from remnant Samuel, in a shirt scrubbed so white it gleamed, Ben fidgeting with his boots. Grace with her bonnet tied crooked. Evelyn's dress was simple blue calico, the one Caleb had insisted upon buying at Boone's despite the whispers. Clara had braided her hair, tucking a ribbon into it with careful hands. Evelyn's cheeks flushed as she caught her reflection in a window pane. She looked nothing like the broken woman who had huddled at the station weeks ago. Caleb stood tall, coat-brushed clean boots polished until they gleamed. His face was solemn, but his eyes softened when they met hers. Pastor Harrow's voice carried steady vows, exchanged hands, joined promises spoken plain and unadorned. When the pastor said, "You may," Caleb bent and kissed her with a tenderness that startled her heart. Not hurried, not uncertain, but sure. The children clapped, their laughter filling the church. Samuel puffed out his chest like a young man. Clara's eyes shone with pride. Ben tugged on Caleb's sleeve and said, "Does this mean you're my pa now?" Caleb smiled small but certain and answered, "If you'll have me." Ben grinned and Grace clapped her tiny hands, squealing. Afterward, the neighbors who had stood by Caleb came forward to shake hands. Pastor Harrow's wife pressed flowers into Evelyn's palm. Even Waylon from the livery offered a stiff nod of approval. The Boones, of course, were nowhere to be seen, but Evelyn no longer felt the sting of their absence. For the first time, she wasn't defined by their sneers. She stood beside a man who had claimed her openly, not as a burden, but as his choice. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in their beds at the ranch, Evelyn stood by the window, the snow outside glowing faintly under the moon. Caleb came up behind her, his arms sliding around her waist. She leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. In the long winters of a man's life, he murmured against her hair, "There comes a day when the snow begins to thaw. Not because the wind has changed, but because someone's hand found yours and never let go." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She closed her eyes, holding to the truth of his words, the weight of his arms around her. For the first time since she'd been cast into the snow, she felt not only safe, but wanted. And yet deep inside, a shadow stirred. The past was not finished. She could feel it waiting beyond the horizon, patient as frost, ready to test whether this fragile spring could truly hold. Morning found the house quieter than it had any right to be. The children worn out by the long day and the excitement of standing up front while Pastor Harrow said words that made everything new, slept late for once. Evelyn rose to a gray light, the sort that softened the edges of a room and made it feel like a held breath. She laid a hand on the window frame and looked out across the yard. Snow lay in tired patches. The ruts of yesterday's comings and goings had frozen into a map only this house could read. Beyond the barn, the firs kept their counsel. Caleb was already outside. She could trace his path in the yard by the neat, purposeful marks of his boots, from porch to pump, to woodpile to barn. Even after a night like that, after vows sealed and the sweet, startling weight of his arms around her, he moved through morning chores as if the sun expected him on time. She set coffee to boil and bread to warm. Her wedding dress hung draped over a chair, blue calico catching the light like a sky she'd worn, and then carefully taken off to keep from wrinkling the day. Her fingers drifted over the fabric, the place where Clara had tucked the ribbon into her braid, still tender on her scalp. She smiled to herself, small incredulous, then went to wake the children. They tumbled out rosy-cheeked and rumpled. Samuel tried to act like a man and failed delightfully when Ben swung him into a hug from behind. Clara smoothed the tablecloth twice before sitting eyes quick to catch every change, the way Caleb's hat sat on the peg like it had always shared space with hers, the way two mugs waited side by side near the stove, the way the house's silence felt sturdier than it had the week before. Grace climbed into her new favorite place, Caleb's knee, and patted his cheek. "Papa," she said, as if she'd always known the word but had been saving it for the right morning. Caleb froze, then laughed a low, surprised sound that reached the corners of his eyes. He kissed the top of her head and shook his head like a man who'd just been handed the best kind of trouble. "Reckon that settles it," he said, glancing at Evelyn. The glance holding a question and its answer at once. After breakfast, they packed the dishes away and found themselves at loose ends, a rare thing. Joy is a kind of labor, too. The body doesn't always know where to set it. Evelyn took down the dress and folded it proper. Caleb came in from the barn and set a small wrapped parcel on the table. "What's this?" she asked. Something Duffy burned out of a scrap, he said, ears reddening just enough to betray him. "Horseshoe iron. Not much to look at, but the pastor said, rings make a circle folks can see." She unwrapped it. The band was simple, hammered smooth, a faint seam like a river down one side. It wasn't fine gold or silver. It was honest iron given a new shape. She slid it onto her finger and felt its cool weight, chill, then warm. "It's perfect," she said. And because she could, she reached across and laced her fingers with his iron and flesh and promise. They spent the morning doing the kind of work that makes noise without demand. Clara helped her tack muslin for a curtain. The boys argued cheerfully while stacking split wood to Caleb's exacting standards. Grace fell asleep under the table with her doll in the crook of her arm. Evelyn moved through the rooms without the old habit of glancing over her shoulder to see if she belonged. She belonged. The word echoed in her somewhere the wind hadn't reached. Near noon, a shadow darkened the doorway, and a gloved hand rapped twice polite as a hymn. Pastor Harrow stood framed by winter light with his wife Ruth just behind. Between them sat a covered basket that smelled like bakery and kindness. "Call this our clumsy blessing," Ruth said, thrusting it at Evelyn before anyone could protest. "Bread, a jar of preserves that turned out sweeter than I meant, and a roast I burned only a little." "You'll stay," Evelyn said, and surprised herself with the ease of it. They did. The pastor held Grace and submitted gravely to the child's exacting inspection of his beard. Ruth guided Clara in slicing the loaf true. Caleb and Harrow moved with the quiet understanding of men who knew how to keep a room calm without speaking about it. Over dinner, conversation meandered like a stream through pasture. The pastor told a story about a calf born on Easter Sunday that thought it was a choir member. Ruth swore she'd heard it try to harmonize. When plates were cleared, Harrow's voice turned gentler. "Deacon Pratt asked me to deliver congratulations he was too proud to say to your face. He meant them." His eyes flicked to Caleb, then to Evelyn. "It's a start." Evelyn nodded. Starts mattered. After they left, leaving behind the warm smell of bread and the cooler echo of words said right. The afternoon stretched quiet. Caleb disappeared toward the back pasture to check a creek crossing. The children took their lessons. Clara sounding out unfamiliar words under her breath. Samuel tracing letters with his tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth. Ben making all of his numbers look like horses, and then demanded the yard. Evelyn wrapped scarves and tied bonnets and watched them go, the door spilling their laughter into air that seemed to need it. She was folding linens when she heard the sound faint, not hoofbeats, not the wind. A metallic ping out near the fence that separated the home pasture from the stretch of scrub and willow. She stilled, listening. There it was again, like a wire plucked. She stepped onto the porch. The yard lay empty except for the children's scattered tracks and the dark line of the firs. She moved down the steps around the corner of the house and followed the sound to the eastern fence line. The bottom wire had been cut, not frayed, not weathered, cut clean and high, and then twisted back together in a way that might hold until a wind came hard. In the trampled snow near the post was the stub of a cigar gone out in haste, the paper mashed, and the tobacco gone to a black stain. Evelyn felt the old cold crawl up from the soles of her feet. She knelt, touched the wire, then straightened and looked to the line of willows 20 yards beyond. The space between fence and brush felt too full, as if someone had hurried to swallow himself in the scrub. Caleb's boots came quick on the packed path. He'd seen her slip out. He always did. He followed her gaze and took in the cut in the cigar in an instant. He crouched where she'd crouched, touched the wire as she had. "Could be boys," he said, not believing it. "Boys don't smoke, though," she answered, nodding at the stub. It was better rolled than anything farmhands wasted coin on. He stood and scanned the willows. The silence out there had a shape he didn't like. He turned, walked the line to the gate, found it latched as he'd left it. They followed the wire west, 50 yards on a second cut waited. Then a third near the corner post, the sort of patient vandalism a man does when he's measuring more than steel. Caleb's mouth flattened. "They're testing the edges." "They'll come back," she said, and hated the steadiness in her voice. Fear had worn grooves in it. Sometimes it ran smooth as truth. "Not tonight," he said, but he didn't say it loud. He flagged the brakes with strips of cloth, quick and competent, so he could find them in failing light. On the walk back, he bent without comment and picked up the cigar stub and a strip of burlap, slipped it into his coat pocket, as if it were a coin he meant to spend later. They got the children inside and fed early. Caleb checked the doors, the windows, the places a man who knows a house knows. He loaded the rifle, not dramatically, and set it behind the wood box. Evelyn banked the fire with more care than usual and told stories with brighter endings than she believed in, because children remember the ends. After lamps were turned down and small bodies had softened into sleep, Caleb sat at the table with the stub on a plate. He worried the wrapper free with a pocket knife and grunted. What she asked. "Cheap leaf fancy paper," he said. "Makes a man think of someone who likes to look richer than he is." "Someone like Frank Denton," she said before she could swallow his name. Caleb's eyes lifted. He didn't smile and he didn't frown. "Denton's not a leader, he's a mouthpiece. But he picks his friends," he said, and tapped the plate for their taste. They slept light. Sleep when it came perched rather than settled. Twice in the night Caleb rose and eased the door open to scan the yard. The stars wheeled. An owl slid past, silent as forgiveness. Nothing moved at the fence line. Morning brought a bright cold and Duffy O'Shaughnessy knocking with knuckles big as river stones. He stamped in, shook frost off his hat, and set a small battered tin on the table. "Found this on the North Road," he said without preamble. "Men were asking questions at the smithy day for yesterday rail hands I didn't recognize. One of them flipped this out when I made it clear my anvil doesn't ring for cowards." Caleb opened the tin. Inside lay 3 cartridges, clean and new. Not a gift. A message. "Any badges?" Caleb asked. "Only the kind a man pins on his own pride," Duffy said. The tall one had a scar from ear to mouth and a laugh that sounded like a mule caught in wire. And he glanced at Evelyn, hesitated, then finished in a way of saying widow, like he'd discovered a trick in the word. Evelyn kept her hands flat on the table so he wouldn't see them tremble. "Thank you," she said, "for the warning." Duffy's voice gentled. "Ain't a warning so much as a reminder. You've got friends, Mrs. Donovan." He said the name carefully and correctly, and the way it filled the room gave her something to hold. Friends with hammers and heat. After he left the house, felt both safer and more threatened, as if armor had been strapped on in acknowledgement of spears. Caleb slid the cartridges back into the tin and put both into the cupboard. He braced his hands on the counter and looked at her over his shoulder. "We'll be ready," he said. Simple as a fence post set true. She nodded, because nodding is what you do when the ground tilts and you decide to stand anyway. She tied on her apron and set bread to rise. He went to the barn and sharpened the axe he hadn't needed in a week. The children read their lessons with unusual care, glancing up at the smallest sound and then pretending they hadn't. That afternoon, Waylon from the livery came by with a wrong turn that set his wagon square in their yard. He didn't come in. He didn't ask for coffee. He only adjusted a strap that didn't need adjusting and said to the air, "Funny thing. A man like Denton finds himself popular with drifters who can't remember where they're going." Then he clicked to his horses and let the road take him. Near sundown, Pastor Harrow rode back with Ruth. They didn't carry a basket this time. They carried themselves like people who knew the value of being counted. Harrow asked Caleb about fence line and men. Ruth asked Evelyn about stew and sleep. No one said Denton's name. Names can grow stronger when you feed them. When the Harrows left and the last of the light withdrew, the house drew breath and set its shoulders. The stove ticked. The wind came thin under the eaves. Out in the dark, the cut wire held with Caleb's temporary twistings, but it would not hold forever. Evelyn stood at the window with her hand on the iron band he'd given her. She thought of the station, of the way the cold had made everything look like it was already carved into stone. She thought of the small church, and the longer vow of bread passed hand to hand of a child deciding a word like Papa for herself. She thought of a wire cut twice and a cigar stub ground into snow. Whatever comes, she said softly to the glass, to the night, to the man moving through the rooms, like a promise kept, we face it here. Behind her, Caleb's voice answered low and sure, here. The next morning dawned pale, the sky washed in a weak gold that never quite shook the frost. The yard looked ordinary frost on the rail smoke curling from the chimney, but the air carried a tension Evelyn could feel in her teeth. The children moved quieter than usual, as though even their play might draw the wrong kind of notice. Samuel checked the latch on the chicken coop twice, though Caleb had already done it. Clara folded her school primers with deliberate neatness. Grace clung to Evelyn's skirts until Evelyn had to peel her fingers loose just to set dough in the bowl. Caleb drank his coffee without speaking much. His jaw worked the way it did when he was counting out details in his head, where the fence had been cut, how many steps from the corner post to the willow thicket, the way the snow told stories if you bent low enough to read. Evelyn watched him. She had seen men wear armor before her late husband had carried his anger like steel, but this was different. Caleb's silence wasn't a wall. It was a ground being tested for roots. Mid-morning, he saddled the roan mare and slung his rifle across his back. I'll ride the creek line. Be back by dinner. She wanted to ask him not to. She wanted to say the word stay, but what she said was, we'll be here, and he understood the rest. The house grew still after he left. Evelyn took up the mending needle, flashing her ear tune not to the children's lessons, but to the yard. The sound of every bird startled her. Every creak in the timbers made her pause mid-stitch. Yet there was comfort, too. The ring of iron on her finger. The scent of bread slowly rising, the warm scrape of Grace's head against her arm. All small signals that life was claiming its ground despite threats. Near noon, Clara fetched water from the pump and came back pale. Mama, she whispered, there's a man on the road. He stopped when he saw me. Evelyn's chest went tight. She set down her work, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped onto the porch. The road lay bare except for a wagon lumbering toward the ridge. A man walked beside it, tall and sharp-shouldered. His coat collar turned high. He had the kind of walk that suggested he wanted you to know he carried time to waste. When his eyes lifted, Evelyn recognized the grin. Frank Denton. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Afternoon, Mrs. Donovan. Fine place you've got. Her hands gripped the porch rail. Keep moving, Denton. You're not welcome here. Now that's unkind, he said, squinting like her words were a jest he hadn't figured yet. I was just admiring your fence. Though funny thing it seems pieced together. Ought to get that scene too. His glance slid to Clara, who clutched the water pail like a shield. He tipped his head too friendly. Young lady. Inside, Evelyn said sharply. Clara darted in, door slamming. Evelyn's breath showed white in the cold. Denton chuckled low. You always did have a way of speaking plain. Shame you married a man who thinks plain talk solves everything. He adjusted his gloves, glanced at the barn. Caleb's not here, is he? Wonder what keeps a man busy when his fences are already breaking. Leave, Evelyn said. For a heartbeat, his grin held. Then it dropped, the mask too heavy to wear long. You'll regret crossing me, he said softly. Men who stand where Caleb stands, they don't last. Folks forget them. And widows, well widows, have a way of needing friends. He turned and walked slow, deliberate, as if each step had been rehearsed. Evelyn stood frozen until the wagon disappeared into the ridge light. Only then did her knees give a tremor. She herded the children close, every one of them sensing something had shifted. Samuel asked, was that man trouble? Yes, she said, but trouble's only stronger if we let it inside. She brushed hair from his forehead. So we won't. When Caleb returned later, his eyes sharpened at once. Something's wrong. She told him steady but brief. His face hardened like iron cooling in water. He listened to the children's version too. Clara's careful detail, Samuel's blunt worry, Grace's childish mimicry of Denton's grin. Then he drew Evelyn into the kitchen, voice low. This isn't just fence testing. He came to measure you, to measure us. Her hands twisted in her apron. He wants to scare us. He wants to own us, Caleb corrected. He poured water into a basin, splashed his face, then looked at her. But he won't. Not while I breathe. That night, Caleb sat at the table with maps drawn in pencil on scrap paper fence lines, creek crossings where the willows grew thick, where neighbors might hear a gunshot. He spoke little, but his hands moved with calm precision. Evelyn stitched quietly across from him, each pull of the thread like a vow. They did not need to say aloud what they both knew: Denton would be back. And when he came, he would not come alone. The next days carried a weight that no sunlight could lift. Even as spring thaw seeped into the soil, the Donovan ranch bristled with watchfulness. Evelyn kept the children close. The path to the schoolhouse was abandoned. Lessons were done at the kitchen table now, with Clara reading aloud while Samuel copied figures. Ben fidgeted until Evelyn's hand steadied his, and Grace sang nonsense songs that somehow made them all smile despite the tension. Caleb worked the fence line with steady resolve hammer ringing against post wire pulled taut under his sure grip. Yet every time the wind shifted, Evelyn noticed his hand drift toward the rifle slung over his shoulder. He did not speak of fear, but the children could see it in the way he checked locks twice, in the way he rose at the faintest sound outside. One evening, when the stew was simmering low and the lamps flickered soft, Caleb gathered them all. His tone was calm but serious, the way a captain might speak before a storm. "Listen close," he said. "If Denton comes again, I don't want panic. I want order. Samuel, you take Grace to the cellar. Clara, you stay by your mother." Ben's mouth curved faintly. "You don't run at men bigger than you." You hear Ben's eyes widen, but he nodded, hugging his knees under the table. Evelyn's heart clenched at the sight of her children listening so intently, their young shoulders carrying more weight than they should. She wanted to gather them up to shield them from every dark thing. Yet she also felt a strange pride they were learning that family meant standing together, not scattering in fear. The night after that meeting, the ranch grew too still. Even the owls seemed hushed. Evelyn woke to a faint creak. Her breath caught before Caleb's whisper reached her. "Stay here." He slid from bed, rifle already in hand, moving with quiet grace. Evelyn rose anyway, pressing a hand to his arm. "What is it?" she breathed. "Riders," he murmured. Her blood ran cold. She moved to the window and parted the curtain. Against the pale moonlight, shadows shifted at the far edge of the yard. 3 men on horseback, sitting like vultures, waiting for something to falter. Caleb's shoulders tensed. Denton's men. The children stirred in their rooms. Evelyn darted to hush them, whispering them back to their pallets, heart hammering with every step. Clara clutched her mother's sleeve. Samuel's jaw set. Ben clung to Grace. "It's all right," Evelyn said softly, though her voice trembled. "Your pa's got this." She didn't realize until she said it that she had called him Pa. Clara heard it, and for a fleeting moment, hope flickered in her eyes. Caleb stepped onto the porch, lantern in one hand, rifle resting easy but certain in the other. His voice cut across the yard, low and steady. "You boys lost." The riders shifted their horses, pawing at the dirt. One man chuckled. "Not lost, just curious. Fine place you've got." "Curiosity's a poor reason to ride onto another man's land," Caleb replied. A pause. Then another voice sneered, "Heard you picked yourself up a widow and her brats." "Generous of you, Donovan. Shame if generosity cost you your ranch." The words burned Evelyn's ears. She pressed her children close, her heart twisting at their wide eyes. Caleb did not flinch. "This ranch stands on work, not on fear. You do well to remember that." The men laughed, the sound carrying like knives in the dark. Then they wheeled their horses and rode off, not fast, not hurried, just enough to say they'd be back. Inside, Evelyn found her hand shaking as she latched the door. Caleb set the rifle against the wall, his face calm though his eyes gleamed hard. "They're testing," he said quietly. "Next time Denton will come himself." Evelyn's breath caught. "What will we do?" He turned to her steady as ever. We'll hold. This land's ours. This family's ours. And I'll see it kept. The fire popped in the hearth sparks shooting upward. Evelyn's gaze caught his, and for the first time she saw the storm not as something to be endured, but as something they might face down together. Her fear did not vanish, but beside it rose something else, resolve. That night after the children were finally asleep, Evelyn sat at the table with Caleb. She reached across the worn wood and laid her hand over his. He didn't move for a moment, then he turned his palm up and threaded his fingers through hers. "They'll come again," she whispered. "Yes," he said. And when they do, he looked at her, the weight of the world in his eyes, but also a promise that felt stronger than any vow. "Then we'll show them what it means to stand." The house fell quiet again. The shadows long, but Evelyn knew the next storm was already forming beyond the ridge. The storm did not come with thunder or rain, but with the sound of hooves hard, deliberate, echoing across the thawing ground. Evelyn heard them before the dogs barked, before Samuel sprang from his chair to the window. The sound was too many to count, too steady to mistake. Denton was not probing this time. He was arriving. Caleb rose from the table, his movements measured as though each step toward the door carried the weight of a choice already made. He glanced once at Evelyn. Cellar. Now. Her instinct was to argue, to say she would stand beside him, but the children's wide eyes stopped her. She gathered them, her voice calm, though her pulse thundered, ushering them down the narrow stairs beneath the trapdoor. The cellar was cool, the smell of earth close and heavy. She kissed each head, whispered promises, then climbed back up before Samuel could stop her. She would not leave Caleb alone. On the porch, Caleb stood waiting. Across the yard, half a dozen riders reined in, shadows stretched long by the lantern light. Denton led them, his hat low, his grin wolfish even in the dark. "Well," Denton drawled, swinging a leg over to dismount. "The man himself. Thought you'd have the sense to come to town and talk this out. Instead, I find you standing proud on land that ain't yours to keep." Caleb's voice was calm, steady as bedrock. "You're trespassing, Denton." Denton chuckled. "You call it trespassing. I call it collecting." He gestured to the fence line. "You think a couple strands of wire make this place yours? Boone still wants what was promised, and I'm the man to see he gets it." "You'll get nothing here," Caleb said flatly. Denton's grin faltered. "Careful, Donovan. I don't take kindly to men who talk big without backing it up." Behind him, one of the riders spat. "Man's got a woman and brats inside. Maybe he needs reminding what happens when folks don't cooperate." Evelyn stiffened, her breath sharp. Caleb shifted slightly, just enough to put himself between her and them. His voice stayed even though the steel in it rang clear. "You so much as step one boot closer to this porch, and you'll find out how I back my words." The standoff hung in the air, heavy as thunderclouds. Horses pawed the dirt, nostrils flaring. Denton's eyes narrowed, measuring Caleb not as a rancher, but as a man unwilling to bow. Then he gave a slow, mocking clap. "Well, ain't this something?" he sneered. "The quiet widower thinks he can play sheriff. But you're alone, Donovan, one man against half a dozen. You can't hold forever." Caleb lifted the rifle. "I don't need forever, just long enough." Denton's face twisted, the grin turning brittle. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might call the order that blood would stain the yard before dawn, but instead Denton spat in the dirt and swung back onto his horse. "Enjoy your little stand," he said coldly. "Next time I won't bring talk. I'll bring fire." The riders wheeled hooves pounding as they vanished into the ridge. Silence settled, broken only by Evelyn's ragged breath. Inside, the children poured from the cellar, Samuel's face pale. Clara, clutching Grace tight. Ben ran to Caleb, clinging to his leg. Caleb bent, resting a hand on the boy's head. His expression calm, though his shoulders carried the weight of a man who knew this was only the beginning. Evelyn touched his arm, voice hushed. "He'll come back." "Yes," Caleb said simply. "And when he does," his eyes met hers clear as winter sky. "Then he'll find we don't break." That night's sleep was a stranger. Evelyn lay awake, listening to the wind creak the eaves, to the faint shift of Caleb pacing the floorboards. She rose quietly and found him at the window rifle propped against the wall, his hand resting on the sill, as though anchoring himself to the land beyond. She stepped closer, laying a hand over his. You don't have to carry this alone. He turned eyes weary but resolute. I asked you to stay, Evelyn. That means I don't fight alone anymore. But I won't let Denton take from us what we've built. Not the ranch. Not the children. Not you. Her throat tightened. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, the two of them standing together in the quiet. Outside, the land slept uneasy, waiting for the storm to break. By dawn, the yard bore fresh tracks along the fence line. Someone had been there in the night, watching. The war Denton promised had already begun. The tracks lingered like scars across the thawing ground. Caleb crouched at dawn fingers, brushing the prints pressed into the mud. More than one rider. Close enough to the barn that the animals had spooked. He could see it in the restless shifting of the horses, the nervous bawl of the calves. Evelyn stood nearby, arms wrapped tight around her shawl, watching him read the earth like scripture. They came in the night, she whispered. They wanted us to know, he said. His jaw set as he rose. Denton doesn't hide his hand anymore. He's showing us he owns the hours even when we sleep. The children joined them on the porch, rubbing tired eyes, sensing the unease that had settled into the very air. Clara clutched Grace's hand. Samuel frowned at the tracks, lips pressed thin. Ben pressed close to Evelyn's skirts, as if her shadow could still shield him. Do we leave? Clara asked quietly. The question cut deep. Evelyn swallowed hard, looking to Caleb. He didn't answer at once. He walked to the porch steps, his back broad, the rising sun catching the rough edge of his profile. No, he said finally. Running only gives Denton what he wants. We hold. His certainty steadied them more than Evelyn could. She gathered the children back inside, setting bread on the stove, though her hand shook. Routine was the only way to keep fear from swallowing the day whole. By midday, the sound of hooves returned fewer this time. Just one rider. Evelyn's heart seized until she saw the familiar figure Jonah Parker, a neighbor from 2 ridges over. He swung off his horse with a grim look dust clinging to his coat. Heard Denton's been sniffing around here, Jonah said, voice low as he clasped Caleb's hand. He came to me too. Offered to buy my grazing rights. Told him to go to hell, but Donovan, he's pulling men together. Not just drifters either. Some ranchers willing to side with him if it means bigger shares of land. Caleb's face hardened. He's building an army. Jonah nodded. And he won't stop till he breaks someone to prove his power. You're the man he set his sights on. Evelyn's stomach turned to stone. She pressed a hand against the table to steady herself. Why him, she asked, though she already knew. Caleb had stood firm where others bent. That alone made him a target. Jonah's gaze softened when it fell on her. Ma'am Denton don't care who bleeds, you and the young ones? He cut off jaw tight. You'd be safer gone. But Caleb shook his head. This land is theirs as much as mine. Leaving gives Denton the right to call it his, and I won't let him write that story. Jonah studied him a moment, then exhaled. Then I'll stand with you. It was not just words. It was a vow. And in that moment, Evelyn felt the balance shift slightly, not enough to break the threat, but enough to remind her that Denton's shadow did not cover the whole valley. That night, Evelyn tucked the children into bed with gentler hands lingering over each of them. Samuel whispered, Will Denton hurt us? She smoothed his hair. No, sweetheart. Not while we're together. You trust me. He nodded, eyes wide but brave. Downstairs, Caleb and Jonah sat over maps spread on the table. Evelyn joined them, folding her hands in her lap, listening to talk of fence lines, choke points, lantern signals. Jonah spoke of others' 2 families who might come if called, though fear held them back for now. Denton's men will come hard and fast, Jonah warned. We'll need more than rifles. We'll need grit. Caleb looked across the table at Evelyn. And faith, he said quietly. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. The following days blurred into a rhythm of preparation. Caleb taught Samuel how to carry a lantern for signals, his voice steady but never fearful. Evelyn baked bread in larger batches, storing what she could in the cellar. Clara sewed torn coats, her small hands working quick. Even Ben, stubborn and fiery, helped Jonah stack wood in places where it might serve as cover. One evening, as the sky bled red at the horizon, Evelyn stood alone by the window watching the ridge. Fear lived in her chest, sharp as ice, but under it thrummed something fiercer, defiance. She remembered Denton's grin, the way he had spoken as if she and her children were already his to command. No, they belonged here to the soil under their feet, to the walls they had built, to the man who had opened his door and said, "I am here for you." When Caleb joined her at the window, she slipped her hand into his. His palm was calloused, warm, steady. She leaned into him, drawing strength. He did not speak, and neither did she. They didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Denton was coming, but they were ready to face him. The storm had not yet broken, but the air trembled with its nearness. The storm broke at dawn 2 days later. Evelyn woke to the dogs barking wild, to the rumble of hooves that shook the floorboards like thunder rolling low across the plains. She rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain, and her breath froze in her chest. A dozen riders crested the ridge, the rising sun at their backs. Dust-billowed horses snorted steam, and in front rode Denton himself, hat-tilted rifle slung careless across his saddle as if he were out for a morning hunt. She turned to Caleb, who was already on his feet, jaw-clenched, hands steady, as he loaded his rifle. "It's time," he said. Evelyn grabbed the children, shepherding them to the cellar. Their eyes were wide, but not with panic. They had been warned, prepared. Clara held Grace close. Samuel carried the lantern just as Caleb had taught him, and Ben, trembling but stubborn, whispered, "We'll be brave, Mama." Evelyn kissed each of their heads, whispered prayers she could barely form, and closed the trap door. She straightened her own knees weak and found Caleb waiting by the door. He placed a hand on her shoulder, eyes burning with something fierce. "Whatever happens, we hold." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. Together. The riders pulled into the yard, their horses scattering dust. Denton dismounted, boots striking the dirt like hammer blows. He looked up at the house, grin spreading. "Donovan." His voice rang out sharp as a whip. "You've had your time to think. Now you come out here and hand over what you can't keep, or I burn it to ash." Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle resting against his arm. Evelyn stood just behind him, her chin high despite the terror clawing her chest. "You've mistaken me for a man who scares easy," Caleb called back. The men laughed. One spat into the dirt. Denton's grin widened wolfish. "You think one rifle's enough to stand against us all?" A new voice cut through the laughter. "Maybe one ain't, but 3 might do." Jonah Parker rode up from the south, 2 neighbors beside him, rifles gleaming in the early light. They swung off their horses and joined Caleb on the porch, nodding firm. Denton's grin faltered. "You think you've got friends enough to stop me?" Denton sneered. "I've broken stronger men than you, and when I'm through, all that'll be left of this ranch is smoke." Caleb's voice didn't rise, but it carried a steel that silenced the yard. "If you believe that, then come and try." The moment stretched brittle as glass. Denton's men shifted in their saddles, uncertain. They had come expecting fear, not defiance. Denton snarled, "Fine. Burn it down." One rider spurred his horse toward the barn torch in hand. Evelyn's cry caught in her throat, but before the flame touched wood, Jonah fired. The torch fell spinning into the dirt, snuffed before it caught. The rider reeled back, cursing. Chaos erupted. Rifles cracked, horses screamed, men shouted. The yard filled with smoke and dust. Evelyn pressed back against the doorway, heart slamming, ears ringing with every shot. She wanted to run to the children to shield them, but she couldn't. Caleb stood in the open, fighting for all of them. He moved with grim precision, each shot measured, each step deliberate. Denton's men faltered, unprepared for the resistance, but Denton himself pressed forward, eyes blazing. He ducked behind a trough, raised his rifle, and fired. The shot whined past Caleb, splintering wood near Evelyn's head. She gasped, stumbling, but Caleb's arm caught her, steadying her before she fell. Inside he barked, but she shook her head, refusing. She would not hide while he stood alone. The skirmish dragged minutes, stretching into hours in her pounding chest. Denton's men, unnerved, began pulling back, their bravado fraying in the face of fire that would not yield. But Denton stayed, his fury mounting with every retreating rider. "You think this is over?" he roared. "I'll come again. I'll come till this place is nothing but ash." Caleb's voice rang clear, final. "You won't leave with that threat on your lips." And then it came, the shot that ended the standoff. It cracked sharp across the yard, and Denton staggered, clutching his side. His men froze, horror spreading. Denton fell to his knees, the grin gone, the fury gone, leaving only the weight of a man undone. One of his riders shouted, "Fall back." The rest wheeled their horses, scattering like chaff in the wind. Dust settled. Silence returned, broken only by Denton's labored breaths. He lifted his head, eyes burning with disbelief. Caleb stood over him, rifle lowered but unwavering. "You brought this on yourself," Caleb said. Denton's mouth twisted. "This ain't over." But even as he spat the words, the strength drained from him. His body slumped into the dirt, the fight bleeding away with the dawn. Evelyn exhaled a sob she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her knees buckled and Caleb caught her, pulling her against him. The porch. The yard, the ranch itself, seemed to breathe with them, as if the land had waited for this battle and now could finally rest. The cellar door creaked. The children tumbled out, running into their mother's arms. Clara wept against her. Samuel's jaw quivered despite his brave face. Ben clung to her waist, Grace babbling in fear and relief. Evelyn kissed them all, holding them so tightly she thought she might never let go. Caleb rested his hand on Samuel's shoulder, then on Clara's head. He looked at Evelyn, eyes soft, despite the smoke and blood and dust that clung to him. "It's done," he said. But Evelyn knew, even in that moment of reprieve, that done did not mean finished. The valley had seen what had happened here. Denton's fall would echo, drawing whispers, stirring loyalties. Some would call it justice. Others would call it provocation. For now, though, for this morning, they had stood. They had not broken. And for the first time in years, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that perhaps they never would. The valley was quiet the next morning, unnaturally, so as if the land itself was holding its breath. The sun rose slow and pale over the ridge, its light filtering through smoke that still lingered from the torches Denton's men had tried to set. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and looked across the yard where the dirt still bore the scars of hooves and boots and blood. Behind her, the children stirred. Samuel was the first to emerge, hair-tousled lantern still clutched in his hand like he couldn't bear to let it go. Clara followed, holding Grace on her hip while Ben pressed his face into Evelyn's skirts. Caleb came last, shoulders heavy, but unbowed, his eyes sweeping the horizon as if expecting the fight to return. It didn't. The ridge was empty. The threat was gone. For the first time in days, Evelyn let her chest loosen. She breathed in the cold air, sharp and biting, and realized she wasn't tasting fear anymore. What she felt instead was something unfamiliar, fragile as glass, but real safety. Caleb stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers. "They won't come back," he said, voice low but steady. "You don't know that," she answered. He looked at her, and in his eyes was the truth she'd clung to since the station, since the moment he'd first said, "I am here for you." He didn't promise what he couldn't. He promised himself. "Then we'll be ready," he said simply. By midday, neighbors began to arrive. Jonah returned with his wife and 2 sons, their wagon piled with food tools and bandages. Another family followed, quiet, but determined, their faces carrying the weight of decision. One by one, more came, men who had once muttered about Denton, but done nothing, women who had feared stepping into the fight. They came now. Jonah clasped Caleb's hand in the yard. Word spread quick. "They know what you did. Denton's name don't scare them like it used to. You stood, and it gave the rest of us reason to stand too." Caleb didn't answer, but Evelyn saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders straightened beneath the burden. He hadn't fought for a cause. He had fought for his family, for her, for the children. But sometimes one act of survival became the spark for something larger. Evelyn guided the women inside, where Clara helped distribute bread, and Grace made everyone laugh with her toddler babble. For the first time since arriving at the station, Evelyn didn't feel like an outsider. She was not a beggar in a waiting room anymore. She was part of something living, rooted strong. That evening, as the sun dipped and the last of the neighbors departed, the house was quiet again. Caleb stood by the window, rifle leaning against the wall, his gaze still turned outward. Evelyn approached, slipping her hand into his. "You saved us," she said softly. He shook his head. "We saved each other." She leaned against him, her cheek resting against his shoulder. The children's laughter carried from the next room, small and bright. For a long moment they stood in silence, letting the sound fill the spaces that fear had once occupied. Then Evelyn whispered the words she had held back through snow hunger and terror. I thought I had nothing left, Caleb. I thought all I could do was wait to be forgotten. But you, she paused, her throat thick. You gave us a home. Not just a roof, but a place we belong. His arm slipped around her waist, pulling her close. And you gave me more than I ever thought I'd have again. Later, after the children had been tucked into bed, Evelyn stepped outside alone. The stars stretched endless overhead, the air cold but clear. She thought of the station, of the endless days of waiting with no one coming, of the snow that buried her hope until it was nearly gone. And she thought of Caleb riding up through the storm, offering not charity, but strength. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not of pleading this time, but of thanks. When she turned back, Caleb was in the doorway, watching her with that quiet steadiness she had come to trust more than her own heartbeat. "Come in," he said. "It's warm." She smiled, stepped toward him, and let the door close behind them. The valley would remember what happened on that ranch. Men would speak Caleb Donovan's name with respect. Women would whisper Evelyn's courage into stories for their children, and the children themselves would grow knowing they had been saved not just from hunger or snow, but from despair. For Evelyn, the memory of the railway station would never fully fade: the cold, the hunger, the hollow waiting. But it no longer defined her. She carried it now as proof of where she had come from and of how far she had been brought. And every time Caleb took her hand, every time the children laughed under the roof they now called theirs, she remembered the moment everything changed. The moment a man looked at her in the ruin of her hope and said, "I am here for you." That moment had saved them. That moment had given them back their lives. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.